The discovery of 6 bodies believed to be of sex workers operating in the Johannesburg CBD has put the spotlight on the question of legalization of the sector in the country. Government says the South African Law Reform Commission released its report on the matter in 2017, but Cabinet has decided the issue needs to be debated. Well, joining us for more on this story tonight is the National Freedom Network's Tertia de Klerk, human rights advocate Steve Letsike, and Asjiki coalition of the decriminalization of sex works, Constance Mathe. Good evening to you, and thank you all for your time tonight. Constance, let me begin with you, because the incident and these horrific killings that were discovered this week, of course, have brought this conversation back onto the national agenda, although it's been an ongoing conversation for a long time now with very little progress.
Sorry, come again?
So I'm talking about the fact that we've seen very little progress when it comes to the advances, in particular for better protection of sex workers.
Yes. As you know, that we have been advocating for the decriminalization of sex work for the past 25 years, 2 decades and a half, and there have been no progress. Though there was a kind of slight changes on 2017 when the multi-party women's caucus was coming out, but nothing has been changed and no protection over the sex workers. The sex workers are still facing the gender-based violence, including the femicide. As you can see, this case currently is a femicide case. It's not a gender-based violence. And then the sexual harassment, police brutality, lack of access to health and justice is still on. Nothing has been changed. Even though we tried to advocate for the decriminalization of sex work and highlight the issues, and the researchers, they've done the work on the ground to prove that the decriminalization of sex work is needed or any change in the sex work industry. But nothing has been done. No one ever cares about the sex workers. Even the outbreak of the COVID-19, they were totally excluded when the people, they were benefiting from their unemployment fund. So it's loud and clear that the sex workers are not recognized at all.
Tertia, let me come to you. You know, when you look at the work that's coming out of government, there haven't been shortages of conferences or even inquiries commissioned into this very conversation, this very topic of decriminalizing sex work. But it seems to just end there. Where do you think the greatest hurdles lie?
I think the greatest hurdle is just basically in the arguments whether decriminalizing prostitution is actually a good idea. We are seeing all these reports of deaths that are happening to sex workers. And the problem with, decriminalizing the sex trade actually opens doors to more sexual exploitation. And what it will be doing is it will be increasing sex trafficking. It will also remove laws targeting the sex buyers. It will normalize male demand for paid sex, and it will actually affirm, the sexual entitlement and feel gender-based violence. So it is, to us who are totally against the complete full decrim of prostitution, really a very clear-cut argument, with full decrim of the sex trade. It will just operate with very little to no oversight. And then we will see minors and other sex trafficking victims that will not be identified because police will be very limited in being allowed to enter or investigate premises, where there's operations of brothels, for instance. And this also means that those loved ones that are going missing will most definitely not be found, because decriminalizing the prostitution trade will just make it so much more difficult. And it will also embolden sex traffickers who see that this is a conducive business environment. So it's a very, very dangerous debate that we're entering. But we have to look at the realities, and we have to look at the facts around us. We see that many women in prostitution actually suffer vulnerabilities and marginalization, and these are the facts that we always have to keep in mind.
Steve, one of the distinctions that is often made is around voluntary versus coerced, sex work. And I'm hearing what Tertia is saying, and, what she says is true, but it doesn't apply to every sex worker in the country. It would apply to some sex workers in the country.
Indeed, Kathy, you are quite spot on. Criminalizing adults who are completely consenting to, to exchange as a service. It's completely incompatible with the human rights, to personal autonomy and privacy. We cannot be in a situation where we speak about fundamental points of what constitute the right to privacy, what constitute to consensual, but also what constitute an allowing and accepting adults who also are exchanging the services for resources. And that's why there has been a distinction of sex work as work. Now, the second thing is that indeed, Tertia is specifying important points, but when you speak about coerced sex work, that's a violation. And, you are talking about people who are victimized, who are raped, who are exploited and exposed to the very same vulnerability that even the sex worker movement has been raising. And, you're talking about exploitation, even taken by many of the police forces or law enforcers in this case, who really completely take advantage of sex workers. Now, we have completely distinguished this. Even the South African National AIDS Council have been very clear about why and what are the benefits of decriminalizing sex work. It's part of the National Strategic Plan, where we want to reduce the abuse, we want to reduce the exploitation, but we also want to look at how the environment of which sex workers work in that space. I don't think this has not been proven. There's enough research in various countries, including in South Africa, in how we want to reduce those vulnerabilities. Yes, options have been placed, whether even by the report by a Law Reform Commission, which spoken about a partial decriminalization. But for over 25 years, there has been a position in the country that has been debated over and over around what will constitute decriminalization. But unfortunately, that conversation goes on without taking the interest of people at heart of what really would create a very conducive environment for sex workers.
I'm going to ask all of you to stay on the line. We're going to take a quick break. We'll continue with this conversation after this. We continue our conversation looking at the decriminalization of sex work in the country. The National Freedom Network's Tertia de Klerk joins us, human rights activist Steve Letsike, and Asjiki Coalition for Decriminalization of Sex Workers, Constance Mathe. Constance, I want to come back to you. Having worked in the industry for as long as you have and representing really sex workers and advocating for decriminalization, do you think that the voices of sex workers are listened to when this conversation is being had? Do you think that their views have been well represented over the years when it comes to this conversation around decriminalization?
Honestly speaking, thank you so much. Honestly speaking, the voices of the sex workers are not being heard. The fact that we are still stuck in that the sex workers are the one, the decriminalization of sex work that we are calling for is for the sex workers. It's not for anyone else. When you look at the country around and you check around, no one is legalized. But some people, they want the sex workers to be legalized. Why do we choose legalization? For themselves, for their moral issues. Let's face the reality. The issue of the sex work is not for the moral issue. It's about the human rights, recognizing someone's human rights. By you legalizing, which means we are putting the policing over the bodies of the sex workers. That doesn't work for a human being. That's why we totally disagree with this. Who are the perpetrators in the industry? 75% of the perpetrators in the industry are the police officers. So when we legalize, we're still going back and give them the power to abuse and violate the human rights of the human beings. Everyone deserves equal human rights. And then this is the reason people like to speak on behalf of the sex workers, not allowing the sex workers themselves to speak for themselves and listen to their voices. We are citizens. We speak for our voices, not other people to speak on our behalf. And then it comes the issue of trafficking. People there is a study. We are talking about the fact, the research. We don't talk about something that doesn't happen. There is a study that just happened now on 2022, which was done by Ntokozo Lingwana from Immigration Center. The study appointed that the people who are trafficked are not sex workers. They are working in mines. They are working in farms. We are talking about the statistics that existing, and it's a 2022 recently now. So why do we at the end of the day, why do we mix these two things and bring in the debate of the sex work? When we are talking about the sex work, we are talking about adult consensual sex work. Someone who is an adult, who has the right to choose what to do and when and how with their body. So why the sex workers' voices are not being heard and given an opportunity to explore and speak for themselves?
I just wanted to explain. Earlier on you spoke about the fact that 75% of perpetrators are police. Please give me a bit more detail, and what figure is it that you're referencing?
The perpetrators are the police officers are the ones that they are taking the power in their hands, abusing the sex workers, using their power, abusing the sex workers, raping the sex workers, collecting the bribe from the sex workers, not allowing the sex workers to practice their human rights while they are detained. So these are the issues that the sex workers, they have to pass through. Let's think about the case, because people are just seeing this case of the 6 women that came out now. What about the last year case that was silenced? The sex workers who drowned inside the river in Durban. The police officers are the people who were chasing those sex workers just because they couldn't, they don't know how to swim. They jumped into the river, they couldn't manage to swim, and they died, some of them. 2 of them, they survived. And what was the case all about? It was silenced. It didn't go anywhere because they are police officers and they are given the power.
All right. Thanks for that, Constance. Tertia, let me give you a chance to come in here and add your own contribution.
Yes, thank you. You know, the argument that we need to really look at is the fact that the system of prostitution does fuel human trafficking. It is just an absolute fact. And I'm one of those people who are working in the front lines on the ground with some survivors who come out of various forms of trafficking, and many of them come from the prostitution system. And it is also those voices that need to be heard. I mean, we know that this debate is on the table, but we find that it's so difficult for those who have actually exited the system of prostitution's voices to be heard. So to be fair, one has to, yes, one can listen to those who are in favor of legalizing the system of prostitution. However, we are asking that the voices of those who have exited the system of prostitution would also be heard. And also keep in mind that it does fuel sex trafficking. And the problem is that so many of our children are also being, exploited within the sex industry.
And Tertia, what about the fact that the current lack of any form of legislation is not exactly leading to decreased levels of sex work? So, again, when we look at some of the reports that have been published, it shows sex work being on the increase. So the criminalization of sex work is not leading to a reduction in sex work itself, because there's so many factors that are driving people into that kind of trade.
Yes, I fully agree with you completely. And unfortunately, what we see in South Africa is no form of legislation is actually going to stop perpetrators. We do have the Pakotip Act, the Prevention and Combating of Trafficking in Persons Act, who it is actually seen as one of the best forms of legislation against human trafficking. So that act is a very good piece of legislation, but unfortunately, it is not being implemented correctly. And if it is implemented correctly, when it comes to sex trafficking, it would also be minimized and reduced. However, what we are saying is if a full decrim of prostitution takes place, it will absolutely skyrocket sex trafficking, because it would be seen as a wonderful open door for better business for pimps and brothel owners and sex traffickers.
All right.
And the problem with prostitution is it does not only harm, an individual, it also inflicts harm on communities and residents and families as well as businesses.
All right. Steve, let me come to you.
Yeah, I want us, Tertia must get her facts right. And I would not want us to entertain where we are not able to distinguish what constitutes a prostitute or what constitutes sex work. First, we must recognize that in this case, sex is work in the case of two adults who are consenting. Secondly, the use of prostitution is stigmatizing and it's discriminatory to adults who actually are in that field of work. And secondly, I want us to, Kathy, these are colonial laws, by the way, and we cannot run away from the fact that people have consistently been criminalized. You criminalize people because of sex trade. You criminalize people because they are gay. All of these things are colonial laws that came, by ship in Africa. Now, when we want to dismantle these very same laws. Right now you're saying, you're on the ground, like many of us are on the ground, and you are not going to be sitting here as if like you are a savior. You are not. When we speak about sex as a consensual exchange between two adults, we must differentiate human trafficking and sex exploitation. It's a complete aspect. It's crime in this country, and we will not entertain that. What sex workers who are standing up and saying we want to be counted as labor forces, we want to be counted as people who are contributing, but we also want our fundamental rights to be protected. And I want us to understand that we are talking about adults who are consenting. But those children and young people who are exploited, it's a criminal offense that we will not entertain, and we want the seriousness of those human rights violations to be investigated and to be prosecuted. Laws that clearly distinguish between sex work and crimes like human trafficking, as she stipulates, must help protect both sex workers and the crime victims. And people who overcome and who explore economic pathways, who are regarded, by the way, in the savior mode, and which is also something that is problematic. When other people who then explore, there's no problem for people to change fields of work. Allow people to do that. But if people come from sex trafficking and exploitation, it must be dealt with a different approach as opposed to dealing with it from a criminal point of view of what others who consensual for that. And I don't think we will also entertain ignoring the importance of how research over and over has consistently spoken about the negative effects of criminalization on sex workers. Their health, their families, their economic, and even their security for that matter does matter. And that's why Constance completely speaks about their voices should not be silenced in any way, because now people are criminalized and we are talking about adults.
Steve,
adults must be respected.
I want to bring in the context of South Africa with its high levels of crimes, hate crimes in particular, gender-based violence crime in particular. And given the context then, what are some of the things that we need to be putting into this consideration and in this debate? Because clearly women and people, like various genders across the spectrum, are at higher risk than perhaps elsewhere in the world.
Kathy, I am of the firm belief government should fully decriminalize sex work and ensure that sex workers do not face discrimination in law or in practice in any way. One, we need to make sure, even the hate crime legislation, for a very longest time, it's over 20 years, our own parliament and our own government is taking law. We have a history of prejudice. We have a history of colonization. We have a history where consistently we have to negotiate what equality, equity, and what a just society looks like. We cannot afford this. What we know is that the very same people, men, privileges, are taking advantage of women, and toxic society is still maintained and in a way that does not guarantee the rights of individuals. I think we've been consistent around making sure that the environment and society must be just. The rule of law must actually be enforced in a way that we cannot negotiate violence. We can also not negotiate incompetence when we seek justice.
All right.
But we need a full protection for everybody in this country, including sex workers.
Constance, Tertia, and Steve, let me thank you all for your contributions to this conversation. We'll leave it there for tonight.